in the auditorium, as well as all of you who are online. I'm Professor Sue Harrison, and in my capacity as Acting Vice Chancellor, I'm your host for this evening, and our Interim Vice Chancellor, Professor Dyer Reddy, is overseas. He sends his good wishes for this event. So I extend a special welcome to the members of the Wolfson Foundation who are attending this event virtually from the UK. The Wolfson Memorial Lecture highlights key global research in areas of public interest and social impact, and UCT is proud to honour our strong partnership with the Wolfson Foundation and our shared commitment to the pursuit of excellence in education and research. And an example of the institutional excellence, this year UCT continues to lead African universities in the 5 major university rankings. In the latest university rankings published by the Times Higher Education, for instance, UCT is among the top 9% of ranked universities globally. Our ranking in the Times Higher Education ranking is 167, and we were very pleased that we improved in each of the ranking sectors, research and teaching and all the others that are there. Of course, UCT's performance in international rankings is particularly satisfying because many of the institutions around the globe have considerably more resources than we do. And also our researchers investigate the critical needs of the Global South and the people living here. And these are priorities which aren't recognized to as high a degree in the global rankings. So we always talk about our rankings. We very much are aware that rankings are important to our reputation, but they are not the drivers of our decision making. We make our decisions on UCT values, and I'd like to actually just add that in here because it's very critical that we are making decisions on the values of our Global South location. So this evening's lecture by Professor Matthew Broome, welcome Matthew, is entitled "In the Middle of Winter, an Invincible Summer, From Delusions to Early Intervention and Youth Mental Health." And this addresses an issue which is becoming more and more prevalent around the globe. The World Health Organization reports that mental health plays such an important role in achieving global development goals that it's been included in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Mental health challenges are manifesting in rising numbers of university students who are reporting mental distress. In the USA, for instance, 2 separate nationwide surveys in 2021 revealed high incidence of mental illness and mental distress amongst university students. In one survey, the incidence was 60%, while in the other, 75% of students surveyed reported moderate to severe psychological distress. In South Africa, the Higher Education Minister, Blade Nzimande, was asked last year at the National Assembly to respond to a report by the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, or SADAG, about the rising number of calls for assistance from students enrolled in tertiary education. In 2018, the UCT Council approved a student mental health policy, which is being implemented by the Department of Student Affairs in collaboration with other departments and Student Wellness Service at UCT. And in fact, we have over the last few years been involved with our partners on the Worldwide University Network at designing a survey of mental health for students around the world, 25 universities, and UCT has played a really leading part of developing that survey. We've piloted it, and we're looking forward to being rolled out across universities on 6 continents over this coming year. So research is essential in addressing mental health issues in the earliest stages of a young person's life, and so we're really privileged this evening to hear from Professor Broome as he discusses his work on the importance of this area. His research interests include youth mental health, the prodromal phase of psychosis, delusion formation, mood instability, interdisciplinary methods, and the philosophy and ethics of psychiatry. Professor Matthew Broome is the Chair in Psychiatry and Youth Mental Health and the Director of the Institute of Mental Health at the University of Birmingham in the UK. He is a leader in the field of early psychosis and in the philosophy and ethics of mental health, and is interested in the onset of mental health disorders in young people. He is the Deputy Editor of the British Journal of Psychiatry and editor of the Oxford University Press book series, International Perspectives on Philosophy and Psychiatry. He is also an executive member of the International Association of Youth Mental Health. Professor Broome grew up in Hertfordshire, UK, and studied pharmacology and medicine at the University of Birmingham. He worked as a junior doctor at the University Hospitals Birmingham before moving to London for postgrad training in psychiatry at the Maudsley Hospital, the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and the National Hospital of Neurology and Neurosurgery, and the Institute of Psychiatry. With colleagues in London, he set up the first National Health Clinical and Research Service on the prodromal phase of psychosis and the at-risk mental state. Before returning to the University of Birmingham in 2017 as director of the Institute for Mental Health and the chair in psychiatry and youth mental health, Professor Broome was a research fellow and lecturer at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London, associate clinical professor in psychiatry at the University of Warwick, and senior clinical research fellow at the University of Oxford. His research is funded by the Wellcome Trust, the National Institute of Health and Mental Health, the UK Medical Research Council, the National Institute of Health and Care Research, as well as an award from the Wolfson Foundation to support the Wolfson Research Unit in youth mental health at the University of Birmingham. Professor Broome, I welcome you, and we look forward to your address.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming this evening, both those in the audience and online. It's a great honour to be here. Thank you very much to the University of Cape Town for inviting me, and to the Wolfson Foundation for suggesting me as one of your speakers in this prestigious lecture series. So I'm going to try and talk through several topics. It's a little bit, I guess, of a historical overview from where I began in psychiatry, really, in the late 90s. So I was a medical student in the 90s and then moved to psychiatry in the late 1990s, where there were concerns about the treatment of schizophrenia, broadening that into the area of early intervention for psychosis and delusions before talking about some transdiagnostic topics in mental health, so around mood dysregulation and bullying. Then before finishing with a couple of examples of the connection between philosophy and psychiatry, and then finishing with some general points on youth mental health, which echoes our colleagues' opening comments actually about the issues we all have to deal with, both as citizens but also as part of a university community. So to acknowledge the support of the Wolfson Unit, as you've heard, they were very generous in awarding us a capital grant to fund a new bespoke unit for us, the Wolfson Research Unit for Youth Mental Health, which has allowed us to bring together academics from across our campus, so social scientists, humanities scholars, basic biological scientists, together with clinicians to work across these three research themes: causes, practice, and policy. And I'll return to some of our research strategy later on. So this is the, I guess, the quote that is part of the inspiration for the title of the talk. So Camus sadly became a bit more popular of recent years because of the COVID epidemic. Everybody was reading The Plague, which was, I think, thought to be an allegory of living under Nazi occupation. But I guess this is a quote of Camus I like to think of about some more autobiographical writings when he returned to his hometown, I think. So I'll just read this out for you. In order to prevent justice shrivelling up, I discovered one must keep a freshness and source of joy intact within, loving the daylight that injustice leaves unscathed, and returning to the fray with its light as a trophy. Here, once more, I found an ancient beauty, a young sky, and measured my good fortune as I realised at last that in the worst years of our madness, the memory of this sky never left me. It was this that in the end had saved me from despair. In the depths of winter, I finally learned within me there lay an invincible summer. And I guess the thing that I like about this is it can be a bit, mental health can be an issue where we think this is jolly hard, we can't help all the people we need. One of the key things we as researchers and clinicians need to do is try and keep a bit of optimism and I guess a bit of willingness to keep on fighting for our patients for the discipline. So I guess that's where I return to Camus' line to help me think about the invincible summer we need to keep within all ourselves. So this is, I guess, jump back to the past. A picture of me in the top left. I was a junior psychiatrist moving to London, and this is a return to what things were like in the 90s in the UK. And you may have a view about whether this is similar or not to how things are in South Africa. So a group of carers, actually, mainly parents with schizophrenia, began auditing the care the relatives were receiving for schizophrenia and advocating on behalf of their relatives through this body called IRIS, as well as the National Schizophrenia Fellowship. And here's some of the data they collated in the mid-90s, that people with schizophrenia were waiting 2 years for treatment. Approximately half were being detained coercively under the Mental Health Act. There's very poor prescribing by psychiatrists. There's little use of psychological interventions, and sort of 15 to 20% were not receiving treatment at all. There's a couple of quotes here from carers who were interviewed. So from a mum, she went from a children's service that didn't do psychosis to an adult service that didn't do young people. Services just seemed to passively wait until he was really ill. The service oozed pessimism, lack of investment, and lack of imagination. This is where we kind of were when I began, I guess, in the mid to late 90s. And early intervention for psychosis was a way to try and remedy some of these concerns. But I'm aware we're a general audience, so I thought I'd start by offering a bit of a definition of what psychosis is. So this is from the American Psychiatric Association. So this was from the previous iteration, the DSM. So you can see here, psychosis for mental health clinicians is a fairly broad brush symptomatic type of definition. So it means simply, you can see here in the second paragraph, the narrowest definition of psychotic is restricted to delusions or prominent hallucinations. So for a psychiatrist or a psychologist, it often just means that delusions or hallucinations are present. And then psychotic disorders are those disorders where these things tend to be quite common and a key part of the presentation. So for example, schizophrenia could be an example of a psychotic disorder. And you can see in the last paragraph there a slightly wider definition that the APA offers us there, including speech and disorganized behavior. So because of these concerns that, as I say, parents and carers raised in the 90s, a model of care was developed. And I guess historically, the two main centres were Melbourne in Australia and Birmingham in the mid-90s in the UK, to try and improve the care for people with psychosis. And this is an editorial we wrote several years ago to try and mark the 15-year anniversary of when these services became rolled out across England. And this new model of care really wasn't due to any new technological impact, any new fancy treatments or medication. Really, it was trying to do things a bit differently. So the goals of early intervention psychosis services are these three. So to reduce this duration of untreated illness, to maximise recovery and prevent relapse, and optimise acute treatment and quality of care. And what was different about EI, so when I switched from normal adult psychiatry to this type of psychiatry, was these kind of features. So working across the adult-child divide, so not having a break in services around the age of 18. So in the UK, imagine it might be the same in South Africa, you're in paediatrics till 18, then adult medicine, child psychiatry till 18, then adult psychiatry. So the kind of false divide here. Working with diagnostic uncertainty, trying to help people regardless of which diagnostic code they fall into. Thinking about psychosis in a staged way. So McGorry, a colleague in Australia, will try and use some of the conceptual tools from cancer colleagues to think about titrating treatment to different stages of the illness. As I mentioned before, using psychosocial intervention, so family therapy, cognitive behaviour therapy, and being aware, because of the age of our population, we're working within normal developmental trajectories, as well as life changes, going to university, leaving home, first job, first serious relationship, and focusing on these things like family, education, and work. And having optimism. So I still hear it in the UK about people with psychosis, they're never going to work, never going to live independently, and trying to challenge that and realise people with psychosis can do incredibly well and move forward after a first episode. The kind of optimism to drive us forward as well. And as I've mentioned, so intervention became more established in the UK in the early 2000s and has led to a lot of kind of research and data, something more sort of more scientific data, but also a lot of health service evaluation and economic analysis. And you can see some of the key findings here, that in the UK context, early intervention seems to save the NHS money. It also hopefully gives a better experience for people with mental ill health, reducing rates of detention, higher rates of employment, lower rates of suicide. But there are still some concerns, some unanswered questions, which is how long are the gains maintained? Are there certain subpopulations we could deliver the care more assertively to, others who may need less care? So a bit about stratification and modifying the package as usual. And we're fortunate that psychosis was the first mental health illness in the UK to have a national target. As a clinician, you always worry about targets that you have to kind of meet, but conversely also it can be quite useful because it helps you ring-fence resources and stops things being taken away from clinical services. And this is the current NHS target for psychosis in the UK, and it's what people refer to as sometimes as two-pronged. So on the left box is a target that all young people with psychosis need to be assessed within 2 weeks, so a time target. And the second is the kind of treatment package target, what we offer all the people we see. This includes things, as you can see, so psychological treatments, family therapy and CBT, but also importantly, physical health assessments, carer support, well-being, education, employment support. So vocational real-world outcomes being really important. Still a tragedy, people with psychosis die 15 to 20 years before those without. So still a huge mortality risk. Okay, so moving a bit more into where my own research came into sort of friction with this kind of work. So when I started as a researcher was early 2000s, and by that time we began developing the early intervention services in South London, in Lambeth. And we were clear that even with these quite good services we developed, people were still having some problems. People may have been ill still for a year or two before coming to us. They were still requiring hospital admission. They may already have suffered some social and occupational deterioration. And we were again aware that colleagues in Melbourne had begun looking at this period before the onset of psychosis, the so-called prodromal, so prodrome meaning before suffering, prodromal period, and had begun to kind of operationalise that into research tools. This is the work of Alison Young, who's now at Deakin in Australia. She was with us in Manchester for a while. But Alison began conceptualising this pre-onset stage as the ultra-high risk or at-risk mental state. And this has been a huge area of excitement and work for mental health clinicians and researchers over the last 20 or so years. And you can see here 2 meta-analyses from colleagues from Fuzor, Polly and Pablo showing how people who score on these tools, who have this at-risk mental state, it predicts psychosis. Not perfectly, by a long way. You can see 25% will become psychotic within 3 years, but better than chance and much higher rates than the general population. So of some use, but not perfect. And I guess why is it not perfect? And those of you, I guess, being a university audience, you deal with young people a lot. So it's because of the non-specificity of some of the problems we deal with. So young people who might be at risk of psychosis have some of these kind of symptoms, and some of those you'll recognise in your own family members, in your own students perhaps, but things like depression, anxiety, irritability, disturbed sleeping or eating can be fairly broad brush, can occur in a lot of different issues, and some things a little bit more specific. Confused thinking, noticing that things and people may seem strange or unreal, being preoccupied with particular thoughts or ideas, unusual experiences, getting a little bit closer to hallucinations, so seeing or hearing things, and very sadly this idea of spending time alone, not socialising, keeping to oneself, and struggling to cope at school, college or work. So one of my first substantive bits of research really was trying to see, could we do in South London what was happening in Melbourne? And for those of you who know London, South London is a very different demographic to Melbourne, a very deprived, diverse, multicultural environment. And we're very proud that we were able to access these young people who were at risk of psychosis in this population, and they match the kind of demographics of that local area of South London. And conversely, we were also it is important for us to see we weren't just addressing people who had unusual thoughts or beliefs, but were genuinely distressed and wanted help. So you can see in our sample in South London, people had tried to access help, typically 2 or so health contacts prior to seeing us. So, for example, would be a university counsellor and a GP, or another psychiatrist and GP. And very commonly, additional comorbidity. So very commonly would be a separate diagnosis of depression and or anxiety as well. But of course, given this was part of a sort of research endeavour, as well as the clinical service and the implementation, trying to access and support these young people, we were also interested in what this at-risk state could tell us about the wider clinical course of psychosis. So obviously, one of the reasons the at-risk mental state, this prodromal phase, was so important is it might allow us a window into what happens when somebody becomes very unwell. One of the mysteries or challenges of psychosis is that a lot of the risk is early in life, so genetic, perinatal risk, but the onset of the disorder is late teens, early 20s. So it's the question of what's happening in childhood, adolescence. And we were trying to think this through at the time, and this paper was an attempt to try and integrate several different models from cognitive psychology, from neurochemistry, from first-person perspectives, and importantly from social psychiatry, so how we could relate things like abuse and migration with more biological accounts. And one of the areas that was really important at the time, and still is actually, was work by Satish Kapoor. Kapoor was at Toronto, then at Melbourne, now back in London. And Kapoor argued that some of the neurochemical changes, so the changes in dopamine in the brain, was linked to the first-person experience of this change of salience. So Kapoor made an attempt to try and connect a neurochemical account with the first-person experience of psychosis, arguing that dopamine would lead to this inappropriate salience. So something neutral had a personal significance. So the way my water bottle is aligned to the keyboard has a great, intense emotional significance to me, and then I come and strive for meaning behind that, okay? This is one of Kapoor's theories, and we tried in this paper to relate Kapoor's account to some of the wider stories in cognitive psychology, connecting this basic cognitive dysfunction to the unusual experiences of psychosis. Some of our work was trying to look at this at-risk group and compare them to those with schizophrenia. This is one of the first fMRI papers that I led on at this time, looking at various tasks, various sort of verbal and memory tasks, trying to compare the at-risk group to those with established psychosis. And again, you can see on these kind of little charts that some changes are occurring that are kind of intermediate from those with established illness. And also my colleague Oliver Howes did the first study of dopamine changes in the brain in live patients, showing again this at-risk group had some changes intermediate between those with controls and those with schizophrenia. So important work again to kind of begin to demonstrate Kapoor's idea, and that some of the neurochemical changes we thought were there in established illness were there at the early stage. And indeed, this work is still really important to the field, and we're very fortunately part of it now. So we're part of this, of the IPAC study, which was led by Alison Young, to try and improve the prediction of psychosis, and with colleagues led by Melbourne. This is an international study led by funded by the NIH, Prescient, which is designed again to improve prediction power for this at-risk mental state, using, as well as the clinical tools we have, but using things like biomarkers and brain scanning and neuropsychology as well. And one of our first outputs from this study has recently been published. So I'm sure, like in other fields, there's these kind of territorial differences. So Europe and Australia tend to use this same method to understand this prodromal phase, and our colleagues in North America use a different tool. So this measure here, the Psychs, was our attempt to start off this new funded project, integrating the two tools into a common process, a common tool to diagnose and assess those with at-risk mental states. Okay. So I mentioned earlier on, when one defines psychosis, delusions are part of that definition. So psychosis can be thought of as the presence of delusions and or hallucinations. So in some ways, they kind of co-vary. If you have a psychosis, you're likely to have a delusion. And these are two definitions here of what delusions are from sort of textbooks of psychiatry. So Sims describes a delusion as a false, unshakable idea or belief, which is out of keeping with the patient's background, held with extraordinary conviction and subjective certainty. This is one from the Oxford Textbook of Psychiatry. A delusion is a belief that is held on inadequate grounds, not affected by rational argument or evidence to the contrary, and not a conventional belief that the person might be expected to hold given their background. So you can see a couple of common themes here: the sense of certainty, rigidity, and the sense of it being out of context. And the newest edition of DSM, this is 2013, American Psychiatric Association, offers this definition of delusions: fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in the light of conflicting evidence, have a variety of themes. Delusions may be bizarre if they are clearly implausible and not understandable to same culture peers, and do not derive from ordinary life experiences. And here's a few little examples, again, from textbooks of delusions that I've certainly seen patients with very similar beliefs to these over the years. So the first one, a man believes that certain songs played on the radio used his voice in the role of lead singer. Very common when I used to work in Brixton. People would accuse rap artists of stealing their voice, stealing their lyrics, stealing their money. A man believes his wife is unfaithful to him because the fifth lamppost along the left is unlit. A woman claims her blood is being injected out of her body in her sleep because she had spots on her arms. And the last one that maybe all married men can relate to, a female subject does not recognise the man who drives a family car and pays the bill as her husband because although he looks like him, he's a bit fatter. So the wife doubts he's the same person. I think if we all had that one. And these are the kind of common themes of delusions. This is quite broad and inclusive. I won't go through them all, but I guess the ones we tend to see clinically are in the top left. So the commonest delusions I would see in my clinical practice are delusions of persecution, which are simply you believe somebody's out to harm you or hurt you or spy on you or bug you, so delusions of surveillance as well, and of reference. And reference is a bit like that kind of Kapur idea, so a neutral event having personal meaning. So the commonest example I would see in clinic would be somebody who is unable to watch television because when they watch television, the characters in the TV show are communicating about them. So try to think of an example, you're watching a soap opera or a drama, and the characters are saying, actually, you know that Trevor, he's a homosexual, or he's a paedophile, or he's a terrorist. Okay, and then, of course, they believe everybody else watching the same show has the same knowledge about this. Capgras and Fragoli are delusions of misidentification. So Capgras, somebody close to you being replaced by somebody who's not. So that's a bit like the example of the husband who's changed size. Fragoli is a stranger who's really somebody you know. So the definition of delusions has created a huge amount of literature. So it's a topic that philosophers, psychiatrists, and psychologists have kind of weighed in on, trying to define delusions, I guess, in contrast to other different beliefs, whether those conspiracy theories or religious belief. And as researchers, we tend to focus more on these criteria, these various dimensions of delusion to identify them. So implausibility, conviction, being unfounded, distressing, preoccupying, and not being shared by others. And I guess if you believe the kind of Kapurian account, you can kind of see why they aren't shared or why they seem strange to others, because if dopamine is doing what Kapur suggests, it's creating this sense of intense personal meaning. It makes perfect sense to the person, but for another person is quite hard to communicate with, so we don't really recognise the reasoning people give for their delusional belief. So as I've mentioned, Kapur, we try to fit it in our work in this more long-standing research from Chris Frith and David Hemsley, who argued that one of the early stages of psychosis was linked to this notion of basic cognitive dysfunction. And this cognitive dysfunction in turn led to unusual experiences. And Maher, a German psychiatrist, said that in fact a delusion is simply our normal reasoning process trying to make sense of an odd experience, okay? So for Maher, delusion is an explanation, a rational explanation of an odd experience. So Maher's work became really important for research and therapy, and I guess cognitive psychologists took it up and modified it slightly. So the model a lot of people work to now is the idea there's this basic disturbance, but rather than being an intact reasoning mechanism, there may be some reasoning biases, some perceptual changes that interact to form a delusion. And these are various factors that people have studied in stage 2. I'll talk about the first one, the jumping conclusions bias, in a little bit. But Chris Frith worked on theory of mind, Richard Bentel on appraisal and misattribution. And I guess a very common and important area recently is computational psychiatry. So again, this is some work of mine looking back at delusion formation in young people in the at-risk group. So as I mentioned, these were an interesting group to us to study because they didn't have the diagnosis, they didn't have a psychotic illness, they didn't have delusions, but they had some warning signs, some risk factors. And we knew from previous colleagues' work, from Philippa Garrett's work, people with schizophrenia and delusions had this reasoning bias, this jump to conclusion style of thinking. So this is a very, so back when I did it, it was a very simple task. It involved literally jam jars and beads, the kind of beads you might wear on a necklace. And you create an experimental tool where you have jars of beads, so classically one with 85 blue, 15 red, one 85 red, 15 blue. You hide them from your participant and you show them a bead one at a time. And you ask the participant, when you're as sure as you can be which jar the beads are coming from, please tell me. And a control would tend to wait for 5 or 6 beads for making a decision. Somebody with delusions would tend to decide after 1 or 2 beads. Hence, it's called jump to conclusions or data gathering bias. Less data is required for a decision, and a fairly robust finding. So our question was, did this bias exist prior to delusions in this at-risk group, prior to diagnosis, and also was it linked to anything? And indeed, you can see on the bar chart on the left. So grey is the clinical group. Our clinical group were having less data than the control groups. They were demonstrating this reasoning bias at the intermediate and hard version of the task. And it correlated with 2 other variables of interest to us. One, this intolerance of uncertainty. So people found ambiguity distressing and unpleasant, but also working memory. and working memory had a different effect in the clinical and non-clinical population. So the non-clinical population, if they had less good working memory, became more conservative, took more data before making a decision. The clinical group, it made them more impulsive, they took less data. And you could argue that could be because they find it harder to hold online or to think with. And we followed this group up, again, in our service in South London. And although this reasoning bias didn't predict psychosis, it predicted the opposite. So the absence of this reasoning bias predicted remission. So those who had these prodromal features got better. They didn't have the reasoning bias. And also, it related to global assessment of function and outcome. And indeed, it's a recent paper from Philippa Garrity, who's my supervisor at the time, sort of surveying the literature since. And Philippa has accounts here 50-odd studies showing this bias has been repeatedly observed in several populations, but perhaps the field's moved on rather than thinking it's purely linked to delusions, maybe more a kind of trait vulnerability in psychosis. And Philippa's current work is how to try and integrate these reasoning styles into therapy. And for those of you who read Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, you can see where she got some of the ideas here, trying to think about adapting type 2 versus type 1 thinking to offset some of these mechanisms in delusion formation in the slow-mo therapy. So that's a bit about psychosis and delusions, and I'm going to sort of broaden it a bit into sort of wider transdiagnostic mental health and youth mental health particularly now. But I'm hoping what I'm trying to show you, I guess, is some of the learning from schizophrenia is now being applied to other areas of mental ill health. So this is work on mood instability and bullying. So after this work in psychosis, I think we all got excited thinking, can we do for other areas of mental illness what we can do for psychosis? Can we find these early signs to identify and predict and help people earlier? And we thought about another major mental illness, namely bipolar. And actually bipolar, still in the UK, I think, is typically 12 years from first symptoms till diagnosis and correct treatment. So it tends to begin late teens, 18, 19. Diagnosis, treatment around 30. So not great. If you think of a young person you might know, that's their 20s, could be quite a difficult time. And people with mood swings find it quite hard to get help. So this is not my work from Guy Goodwin and colleagues, showing that people with mood swings struggling to get help. They don't know, they don't get understood, they find it hard to convince clinicians and can feel dismissed. And indeed for psychiatrists, or including me, I was always trying to think, if you've got mood swings, does that mean you're bipolar? Does that mean you have borderline personality? Trying to crowbar people into very unsatisfactory categories. So we began doing some sort of simple work, and like any part of research, the first thing to do is try to count the thing you're interested in. So we began doing some epidemiology, using a large psychiatric survey in the UK, and we showed in this work that around 14% of the population endorsed the belief that they had mood dysregulation commonly. And I guess our hypothesis was this was a young person problem, but actually it tended to remain at quite high rates throughout adult life, finally dropping a bit in later life. And I guess, again, contrary to our guesses, where we thought it would be very much linked with certain personality disorders or bipolar, actually, I think it was most common in obsessive compulsive disorder, but also things like anxiety, depression, and post-trauma. So again, your predictions as a clinician get thwarted. And I guess importantly, again, in the analysis, you bracket off diagnosis, mood dysregulation, mood instability, in and of itself, predicted health service use. So that's like seeing a GP, getting a prescription cashed in, but also suicidal ideas had a real-world impact on people. We were also interested in how psychosis and mood dysregulation interacted, and again, work on this sample demonstrated that mood dysregulation predicted paranoia and, to a lesser extent, hallucinations. And also importantly, I mentioned the work earlier on in psychosis around connecting major mental illness with adverse life experiences such as migration or trauma. It seemed that mood dysregulation had an important role connecting childhood sexual abuse with the onset of paranoia in people. So it seemed to be very relevant. And then in the context of bipolar, some features quite similar. This is a different cohort. This is the Bipolar Disorders Research Network from the UK. And again, you can see here how for bipolar across the board, the effects of childhood abuse are quite marked in the way the illness develops, so have a younger age of onset, linked with suicidal behaviour and substance misuse, but also is connected with both mood instability and impulsivity, which in turn can make the disorder have a more tricky course, including having more frequent episodes, more episodes of mania, rapid cycling, and depression. So mood dysregulation seemed to be an important transdiagnostic target that both changed the course of psychosis and bipolar, but also was very common in a variety of different mental disorders and was quite unrecognised by clinicians, mental health clinicians. The area I've not mentioned, I've got more interested in since, is ADHD, whereas when I was a trainee, ADHD was always thought to be a sort of motor and cognitive disorder, but emotional dysregulation is increasingly recognised as part of that phenotype as well. So the second example of sort of transdiagnostic or preventative mental health is in bullying. So this was something I began working on when I was in Oxford, and I continued that in my time in Birmingham. So what is bullying and why is it important? So as people will know, so bullying is an exposure to negative actions repeatedly over time, where there is a power imbalance. There are a variety of types of bullying, so physical, verbal, social manipulation, cyberbullying, and it's preventable. And what is striking, so if you're a childhood victim of bullying, some of those effects can last till your middle age. Certainly, there's data there. And those effects are not just mental health. They're things like relationship status, income, marital status, employment, and also things like diabetes and cardiovascular status. So this early adverse experience has quite long-standing impacts for people. In the UK, it's sadly quite common. So about a third of children report being bullied, and those children who have multiple episodes of bullying will also have numerous educational outcomes, including exclusion from school. And again, we're interested in the relationship between bullying and psychosis. This is work with my colleague Gennaro Cottoni. Gennaro's a psychiatrist from Naples who came over to work with us in Oxford. And Gennaro was seeing children who had been seriously bullied, who was then seeing over years who developed mental health problems linked to that bullying experience. And again, Gennaro was able to demonstrate in this work, we're publishing it in the Lancet Psychiatry, that showed that bullying doubled the risk of persecutory ideas, predicted the onset of psychosis, and that seemed to be stronger than hallucination. So again, bullying, a bit like mood instability more generally, had a big effect on persecutory ideas and the diagnosis. And further work on this data set allowed us to try and think about the kind of causal pathway, trying to break this down a bit. And you can see here that bullying had an effect for young people on their drug use, their levels of worry, mood dysregulation again, persecutory ideas, and then a little bit downstream on low mood, sleep and anxiety. And finally, hallucinations. In some ways a bit counter to what I told you before, with unusual experiences coming first. In this kind of method, or this kind of analysis, we're able to show that maybe the bullying and the paranoia came prior to the unusual experiences. And of course, one of the reasons bullying is important is because it could be something we could do something about to prevent mental health outcomes. And this was, I guess, an important piece of work for us. So this was a trial we've just finished, the Stand Together trial. And this was funded by the NIHR in the UK, but also by HSBC. So that's an international bank that is UK headquarters in Birmingham. They're very keen to support our research. And this was really, looking back on it, trying to do a trial in schools during the pandemic was a little bit heroic. So we began this work in 2019, started it in 2020, and then had to pause it when schools closed in the UK, and then picked up the trial and just finished it last academic year. But a nice quote here from Paulette, who's one of the, you can see a director of school improvement. So Paulette was visiting some of the schools who were part of this study in Birmingham. So we tried to roll out a Kiva intervention. Kiva is a Finnish anti-bullying intervention. So Paulette says, just returned home having attended the Ofsted feedback session at one of our Birmingham schools. The lead inspector could not say enough about how wonderful the impact Kiva has had on the school. The staff and children were so complimentary about how it was making a difference to their lives at school and out in the wider world. The inspector said the facilitators must be of expert quality. This is my colleague Sajda Butt, who is the facilitator, to have drawn out such deep and sustained impact on the school community. So challenging work, but really good to see. And in Birmingham, we managed to recruit over 5,000 children across 29 schools at the age of 7 to 11. And I think you're the first audience to see this because my colleagues said I'm allowed to tell you things in the abstract. The paper is in submission at the moment. And it's quite, I guess, a big deal for us in the UK. It's one of the first preventative mental health trials. I think we want to prevent things. It's quite hard to do in a kind of universal prevention. So we were able to recruit across the country, 118 schools, over 11,000 children, and a change in bullying. Quite small difference, but from 20.3% to 17.7%. and the students in the Kiva arm had higher empathy and reduced peer problems. So what we're working on now is that although there's this small to moderate effect, how does this scale up? So because there's huge numbers here with a potential long timeline, I mentioned the 50s, this could be a economically advantageous public health initiative really to take forward. So one of my goals is really to maintain this in Birmingham schools, then for us to petition with the UK and the Welsh Government, actually, our colleague who's the lead is at the University of Bangor, to make this go forward. Okay, so that's a bit on psychosis, transdiagnostic stuff, and I'm going to sort of change tack slightly on the work I've done in connection between philosophy and mental health care. So I know Dan Stein, your Professor of Psychiatry here in Cape Town, is an area of interest for Dan as well. So a lot of work I've done over the years has been around this branch of philosophy called phenomenology and its connection with psychiatry and psychopathology. And this can be a bit of a quagmire in terms of terminology and words. Those of you who are philosophers or know the word may agree or disagree with my little classification here, but a lot of clinicians use the term phenomenology to mean psychopathology, and we've done some of that today. We've talked about the definition of delusions, a good example of descriptive psychopathology, and those are the kind of textbooks I read when I was a trainee, so Sims, Symptoms in the Mind, and Fish's Psychopathology. A philosopher, when you say phenomenology, would think of Husserl, de Beauvoir, Sartre, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty. And you can see one of the kind of inaugural texts there, so Husserl's ideas. But what we try and do, or what a tradition of phenomenological psychiatry tries to do, is kind of merge these two, so the experience and the symptoms of mental illness with this more refined philosophical understanding. And this is a paper that Giovanni Stangolini, professor in Florence, and I wrote several years ago, arguing for why this approach to understand the symptoms of mental illness is important for clinical training. So we argue that psychopathology is not only the way you have a knowledge of the abnormal phenomena of mental illness and a way to appraise and code them, but also it allows you to have a way of engaging with people that's person-oriented as well as illness-orientated. So the kind of approach we kind of argue for in this paper is that clinicians should try and use the meaning of experience in a twofold way, both do your job as a kind of clinician to try and find out what's going on, chart the symptoms, think about your treatment, but also as an important area of personal meaning for the individual to explore. And having those two approaches working in parallel encourages therapeutic partnership. So for us, the famous figure is Karl Jaspers. So Jaspers was a psychiatrist, lived throughout most of the 20th century. But in 2013, he published his first book, General Psychopathology, that was revised up until the 1940s, I think. He was under house arrest. He had a Jewish wife. So he was literally waiting for deportation to a concentration camp when the war ended. So he had a very intense war, banned from teaching, banned from practice. But Jaspers tells us what methods he thinks we should do to try to understand our clinical work. And there are three tools he draws on. One is observed behaviour, like any other clinician. The second is this description and demarcation of mental events, phenomenology. And third, draws from the German tradition of hermeneutics, try and put oneself in one's shoes, try to relive and understand the experience. And Giovanni and I currently have a Wellcome Award to try and examine this tradition for contemporary times from the Wellcome Trust. Phenomenology was really important in post-World War II psychiatry in Europe and North America to try and operationalize and define our diagnostic criteria. But our view was that it had neglected some of the wider theoretical inputs. And also importantly for us, we're very keen to get a more global group of scholars to get engaged with this tradition. We're aware it's lots of dead European folk who work in this area, and to encourage that, and also very importantly scholars with lived experience of mental ill health. And this Wellcome grant has allowed us to award several small awards, including exchange fellowships, small grants, translational funds and conferences to try and get a new body of scholars internationally engaged in this, which has been really fantastic. So I want to mention some work in this area by my colleague Rosa Ritananu. So Rosa is a psychiatrist and PhD student currently visiting Melbourne at the moment. And Rosa's interest goes back to this paper I mentioned of Giovanni's and mine, looking at the meaning of the experience. So Rosa's interest is that are these delusions, these very strange, unusual worlds and beliefs people live in, somehow not taken seriously enough by clinicians? Do we just see them as a dysfunctional or deficit state? What is it like to live in this strange reality, this different reality? There had been something written about this, so not as much as you would have think, given how prevalent and important these things are. There's a few papers there with some evidence delusions can enhance purpose in life, they can contribute to a sense of coherence, they can give purpose, and this is despite them being generally distressing and upsetting. Okay. So Rose has currently just completed some empirical data collection, as in the process of analysing it, but prior to that, she carried out a systematic review of the qualitative evidence of delusional beliefs, looking at how people make sense of themselves, the world, and the meaning. I'll just go through some of these key findings that we had. Again, this was in Lancet Psychiatry last year. So the themes that came out of this work was that people often experience this radical rearrangement of the lived world, dominated by intense emotions, a doubting, losing, and finding oneself again, and a searching for meaning beyond search for meaning, belonging, and coherence beyond mere dysfunction. And some examples of those, and these are obviously patient testimonies that came up in part of this literature review. So a lightning bolt hitting my world, I couldn't escape it. And the last quote at the bottom, the entire world seems to implode upon you. Nothing is as you thought it was anymore. You can't trust anything anymore. Everything is possible. So a really dramatic shift in the world. So delusions are not just about believing X is Y, your whole existential gestalt kind of shifts. About one's self-identity, I wasn't part of this world anymore, I didn't have a self to experience, perpetual questioning. And at the bottom, a sort of grandiose claim here, I feel strong and powerful, able to do anything, you become the person you always wanted to be or better, and then a deep depression afterwards. And finally, search for meaning, person looking back here in the first quote, I can't really understand it anymore. The bits that were so surreal and bizarre, I can't really understand them anymore, even if I ever could. Like a tree stump and like I had a nail driven into me. Everything becomes completely clear for you. It is the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. So Rosa's kind of work with our wider group here is trying to think about delusions in different ways. And I spoke about some of my early work looking at the kind of subpersonal mechanism of delusion, the kind of cognitive biases, the neurochemical story with dopamine, the neuroscience approach, but also you see here in these accounts the level of meaning and how that's drawn on by people to experience and describe the delusions, both with their kind of socio-cultural level, but also their personal and interpersonal level of meaning. And the second example of, I guess, philosophy and psychiatry we've worked on is this agency in mental health project, which has been funded by 2 awards from the Medical Research Council. And this was really an attempt to think about things as agency, justice, and social identity in young people. And it was a really nice, diverse research group, including researchers with lived experience from McPin and facilitated by Rachel, but also academics from psychiatry, philosophy, psychology, sociology, and communication studies. And this work was I found it quite hard to do as a clinician, actually, because what it involved was videoing live consultations, acute consultations with young people in distress. So typically it'd be a young person who's gone to an accident emergency department, either with thoughts of harming themselves or having tried to harm themselves. And what we did with the lived experience researchers was trying to comment and understand the consultation and how a young person's agency, sense of justice and sense of involvement could be enhanced. And you saw quite a lot of not great practice watching it. And these are some of the things the young people and ourselves thought were really important to develop from the analysis of these consultations. So the importance of being involved in decisions, the importance of validating experience. We quite often saw almost quasi-legal consultations where the clinician would say, but you were out seeing your friends last night, you can't be that ill. Almost like a kind of legalistic, rather than saying, how can I help you, what can I do to help you? This is tough, what can we do together? Affirming the capacity to change and avoiding objectification. And this work has now, we've sort of described what we've seen, and now it's the opportunity to try and think about how we can change things. So this is a paper led on by my colleague Lisa Bortolotti, who works in philosophy, to try and think about how we can improve clinicians, but also young people, in moving a consultation to this more agential stance, as Lisa puts it, so making the patient more of an agent in their own care. And she's described this as a ladder where we can help clinicians and young people move up from validating experiences to being involved in decision-making. And those who want to hear more, you can listen to the actual lived experience researchers themselves in a podcast that McPin made for us. Okay, I think I'm probably coming close to time. So this will end with some sort of more general points about youth mental health, which we've heard a little bit about. So I think there are two reasons why youth mental health is a really important area. And I guess the one is I've already alluded to, really. All mental health really is really a youth mental health problem, in the sense that what we know is that most lifetime mental health problems begin in the mid-teens and early adulthood. So the disorders I've talked about, bipolar, schizophrenia, tend to begin early on in life. That's a really key, important reason. And this kind of shows it graphically, really. So you can see there, if you look at between the 15 and 20, the most major mental health problems begin then. And this, again, is the time when the world revolves around the young person. They might change their levels of clinical care from paediatrics to adult, as I've said. They may move to independent living, move to work, move to university. So a lot is happening. And that's also the peak time for onset of disorders. So that's one reason. So working with young people helps us think about the future, maybe help us prevent the future, but also help them now. And we heard earlier how rates of mental health problems are increasing dramatically in young people. And there's several bits of data that support this, sadly. So there's, certainly in the UK, hugely increased numbers of referrals to services. I imagine it might be the same in Cape Town. Much higher self-prescription rates, again in undergraduates, but also elsewhere. There is quite strong scientific evidence that rates are increasing. And it's not across the board, so it's not that everything is getting worse. It's some things particularly getting worse. And the area that's increasing the most is what's sometimes referred to as internalizing disorders. So that's depression, anxiety, self-harm, eating disorders, and sadly in adolescent and young women. And suicide and self-harm is also increasing in young women. And this is the NHS digital survey here, which is done every year. And the last set of data from 2022 showed that 18% of young people between the age of 7 to 16 have a likely diagnosis of mental ill health. And the last bullet there is this sort of age group 7 to 19, so the sort of end of adolescence. And you can see the changes over the last 5 years, where it was 1 in 10 in 2017 to now 1 in 4 in 2022. And of course, this is not just a UK problem. Mental health problems affect 10 to 20% of children and adolescents worldwide. Most children and adolescents live in lower and middle income countries. And again, much like I said about bullying not being in isolation, poor mental health in childhood has numerous impacts, including educational outcome, substance misuse, violence, and reproductive and sexual health. So globally, mental and substance misuse disorders are a leading cause of disability in children and young people. And of course, we all know that there's been a further blow to young people in that COVID has happened and they have increased these already increasing rates. So again, a meta-analysis, I think from last year, estimated that rates of depression and anxiety in young people had approximately doubled since the pandemic. So what can we do? This is a challenge, really. So this is back to, I guess, the clinical services. And this is the work of Pat McGorry in Australia, who's developed a network of services called Headspace throughout Australia to try and think about how we can support young people. He again argues against this false age divide. So 12 to 25, you can see Pat's mentions there, making services that are developmentally and culturally appropriate, co-designed with young people, accessible, a soft entry, so not huge amounts of referral paperwork or phone calls or GPs fighting your corner, community-based, non-judgmental, non-stigmatizing, and the importance of trust and family and friends to be included. And I guess this kind of balance between being very focused on primary care and GPs, but also when needing it, good links with more established secondary and tertiary care services. And this is what we try to do in Birmingham. So Birmingham is in some ways a very good place to do mental health research, but also quite a tough place to do mental health research. We are one of the youngest cities in Europe, so 40% of our population are under 25, 1 in 5 are overseas, a lot of poverty. So pre-pandemic, this was about 37% now. I think it's over 40% of families live in poverty, and you can see a map from the council showing the red areas, and it's the first minority city in the UK and is super diverse in terms of population. But we do have a dedicated youth mental health service that tries to offer flexible, easy access between the ages of 0 to 25. But not a panacea. I mean, there are issues I was speaking to one of your colleagues in child psychiatry this morning, actually, so issues also in the UK about how this is managed. There is still increasing unmet need. There is increasing complexity and difficulty of helping young people who come into services. And crucially, with current economic changes in the UK, there's been decommissioning of other allied support structures that are really helpful to young people, such as housing and social care, also charity sectors withdrawing from healthcare provision. There's a workforce challenge. So again, I'm not sure how much you're aware of, but since the pandemic, a lot of colleagues have left the NHS, and there's been a lot of industrial action lately. And I guess there's a kind of more conceptual training issue, how we can break disciplines from thinking of it as either as child or adult clinicians to working in youth mental health more generally. And that's something, one of my jobs to pick up actually, because colleagues in Australia and Ireland have began to kind of push for the accreditation of youth psychiatry as a speciality, so whether we can try and do that in the UK as well. Okay, so I'll wrap up now. So our kind of approach and the challenges is to try and think about mental health in a complex way, to think about how we can both prevent people with mental ill health, and the example is bullying as one of the ways we do it, but also to respond to those with mental ill health now with developing new treatments, and lots of my colleagues involved in medication trials and trials of new treatment. And we try to organise our research across these various research themes, but a key part of everything we do is the co-production of our research with young people themselves with lived experience. And we're very fortunate to receive an award earlier this year from the Department of Health in the UK for Midlands Translational Research Centre of Excellence, which is a £10 million grant to allow us to increase our research capacity in the area, increasing our trials, digital platforms, and also training and development of clinical academic staff. So whether it's nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, to improve our mental health research infrastructure in the UK. So to end, I want to thank you all for the very gracious invitation for coming tonight. So thank you to the University of Cape Town and to Wolfson. I hope what I've shown you today is that despite those concerns of parents in the 90s, some of this driving for improved better care for schizophrenia has had a knock-on effect for us thinking about how we can prevent and understand other mental disorders earlier. Really important, we involve young people throughout. This is a picture of, they like to call it YAG on tour, so Youth Advisory Group on tour. So we managed to fund a lot of our group to go to Copenhagen for the Youth Mental Health Conference, where they presented some of their work they've done with GPs, about helping GPs work with young people with suicidal ideas. And how important those first-person perspectives are, and more widely, how we can democratise knowledge generation in mental health. I think funders, including Wolfson, with a generous award to us, have recognised there's a complexity in mental health research that perhaps has been minimised in the past, and there's been a lack of progress where our patients aren't having better treatments. So we need to think about interdisciplinary approaches and include our whole academic community. But there are very real demand and capacity issues around the structure of services and the workforce. And I guess the last point is just to be aware the pressures that young people face, really. We talked about economics, certainly in the UK, very much about cost of living crisis, seeing parents not be able to afford their mortgages, going to food banks. There's concern about climate change, the pandemic, discrimination, migration and trauma. So a tough life. And we're very, very grateful to be able to work with such a wonderful, wonderful group and seeing them develop with us and guide our research. So I'll finish by thanking all my funders and supporters we work with, particularly the Wolfson Foundation, for hosting this today and for funding us. So thank you very much for your time and attention. Cheers.
Thanks very much, Matthew. I'm going to open the floor if there are any questions, just for a few minutes. I think it's nice to interact. Anybody would like to raise any questions? Please, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi. This is a layperson's question. More about auditory research
Yep.
and delusion. Why are they so... That's not always the case.
Yeah, I don't think we know. I mean, that's one of the things that I guess links a bit with the Roses research. So what science is quite good at is telling you the mechanisms and how things might happen, but not great at telling you the meaning or the content of what happens. That's even a question with delusions. Why are they persecutory? But you're quite right. Most hallucinations are personally demeaning or rude. They will say you're a horrid person, you're a stupid person, you're a sexually promiscuous person. It's that kind of content, but we don't quite know. I mean, one of the ideas of hallucinations is it's misrecognition of one's own internal thought processes. So it's kind of subconscious negative thoughts one has that stop being identified as one's own thoughts. Again, this is some of Chris Frith's work, actually. You don't tag your thoughts as your own. They get experienced as alien and then thought to be a voice. But we don't know. And this is where, I think neuroscience has a real challenge, how we can move from mechanism to understanding the personal content. I think it's a really, really good question. And indeed, for treatment, you can quite often get a shift. So hallucinations might not end, they can become more neutral. And for many patients, that can be quite enough. So I had a patient, one of my first patients I ever saw, actually, who'd been in hospital for most of her adult life. And she was saying, now, doctor, I just hear my old GP read the Bible with me. And she was very happy with that. She could read, whenever she read, the GP would read alongside her audibly. But because that was a neutral, positive content, completely fine. Yeah, it's an important point. Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll close that now. So,
thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matthew. It's been a really, really wonderful lecture, and thank you for that.
Thank you.
I think we sort of come from the place that we all know that this is such a growingly important field, and we have the figures from World Health and so on this, but we also know, working in universities, we know how we really are having to deal with this on a daily basis. And I've been fascinated, I mentioned earlier on the Worldwide University Network, universities around the world, we're all dealing with the same thing, and we're dealing with it on a much, much bigger basis. And what I really enjoyed about your talk tonight is you've got into the depth of the subjects, but at the same time you've taken us to the spaces of looking towards health rather than fixing illness in your bullying work. And that's something in this country that we're really looking at. How do we work towards preventing the malady and building healthy people, because we're much more efficient to do that. Yeah. So I really enjoyed that part of it. And then I also really just wanted to comment on, it's the time of our careers that you're talking about, and yet the movement of from what you talk about in London in the 90s to how mental health is dealt with now. It's just such a transition, and what an honour it must have been to work in this field over that time and contribute to those changes. So thank you for showing us that insight into that space, and really bringing us to see that space. We've really appreciated it.
Thank you, that's very kind.
I'd just also like to thank my colleagues who helped us set up this lecture, the Development and Alumni Department and the Information Technology Services. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank particularly the Wolfson Foundation for their partnership with UCT and the ability for us to hold this lecture series on a regular basis. And finally, all of you who have attended the lecture, be it online or be it here sitting in the auditorium, thank you for showing the interest, thank you for taking part and keeping our thoughts on these many different really important topics alive. I hope you'll join us for some refreshments outside, for those of you who are here, and thanks once again, Matthew.
Thank you very much indeed. Cheers. Thank you.